Okay, guys, what we are going to be doing today is going to be the last chunk of this unit. I always save this portion for last because the sentencing and punishment portion of the criminal justice system is really the final phase of the criminal justice process. So I wait usually until after our mock trial so that we can kind of have some examples of what the sentencing and punishment phase looks like for the criminal justice process. So I'm going to actually kind of be using our court case as some examples here. Once the courtroom proceedings have taken place, it's going to be up to really the final step. Now, as we've talked about, it's the jury that ultimately makes the decision if this person is guilty or not guilty. Now, we've kind of talked about, too, how a prosecutor is going to throw a bunch of different charges at a defendant and see which one sticks. Now, in our particular instance, we saw that in the Chris Archer case, this person is going to be charged with murder and also criminal hazing. Now, of course, it depends on the class as to how they are going to find Chris Archer. But oftentimes what we're going to see is that that person might be found guilty of one particular charge, but maybe not the other. So it really comes down to when the jury finds a defendant guilty, most of the time the sentencing is done by the state, done by the judge, where the judge gets to determine what the punishment's going to be. We've talked about in the past, too, how there are some instances where a jury can determine what the punishment is, but that's not necessarily commonplace. There are also instances where a jury can suggest what a punishment might be, but ultimately it really does come down to the state. They get to decide. Now, we've also talked about how there are some instances where particular crimes have minimum sentences, where if you do this, you must serve at least X amount of time. There's also the other side where some states and some crimes have maximum sentences, where you say you cannot go beyond this. But there's a lot of wiggle room where a judge can say what he decides what the punishment will be. Now, of course, depending on the crime committed, sentencing can take a bunch of different forms. It's not just necessarily jail time that can be punishments. In the past, we've talked about some of these, but I do want to refresh your memory about what some of these might be. Because, of course, depending on the crime and also depending on just certain circumstances of the defendant, you might have a situation where the punishment is reduced because either being that this is the first time this person has ever been convicted of a crime or other kind of outstanding circumstances where the court might look favorably upon a defendant and reduce a sentence, whereas someone who might be coming through the criminal justice system over and over again, the judge might determine that obviously something's not there has to be a more severe punishment for this person because they're not, in fact, rehabilitated. Now, we're going to talk more about that going forward, but I do want to kind of talk about first the lesser degrees of punishments. So if we're talking about lighter sentencing options, again, it could depend on just the crime that was committed or the circumstances of the defendant. We have talked about probation in the past. Now, again, just kind of to remind you that probation is really saying that you just have to follow certain court-ordered guidelines. It might be you can't leave the state. It might be that you have to check in with parole officer. It's just kind of basically a way for the state to keep tabs on you and be certain that you are not falling into patterns of behavior. And if you break any of these court-ordered rules, then yes, the punishments get considerably harder after this. Now, also, there's suspended sentencing. A suspended sentence is basically saying we are not going to actually send you off to jail or to prison just yet. We are going to basically put you on probation, and as long as you fulfill your probation and its requirements, then there's no need for you to actually go to prison. Now, if you, in fact, do break that probation, then yes, your suspended sentence will be in fact enforced, and they're going to take you off to jail or prison. There's also home arrest. Now, again, we've kind of talked about this in the past. What this is basically saying is that you're not going to go to prison, but you are going to be confined to your home, where they can monitor people with the ankle bracelet, the GPS monitor, to be certain that you are staying within your home or within just kind of certain distance parameters. Now, these are kind of the lighter sentences. These are more reserved for lighter crimes or for someone who has not necessarily had a history of criminal issues in the past. Now, as we go on to the next section, the harsher sentencing, I put on here fines and restitution. Now, again, we've kind of talked about fines in the past, where a fine is going to be a certain amount of money set by the court that you pay to the state, that you pay to the government. That's a fine. Restitution is where you're convicted and you must make up for the whatever losses or injury that was caused to a victim. So this can be used for criminal proceedings, but oftentimes this is going to be what's used for civil proceedings. Now, you guys saw in the OJ episodes where O.J. Simpson was found not guilty of criminal proceedings, but then he was taken to civil court where he was in fact found guilty, and he was fined millions of dollars that had to be paid to the victims of what that court found him to be guilty of. So he had to pay millions of dollars to the victims of Nicole and Ron Goldman. Now, for his restitution, there are some different things that kind of take place depending on moving between states, where he doesn't actually have to pay the entire amount that it was determined he would, but he does still have to pay a certain amount of money for restitution to make up for the losses to that families or to the families of the victim. Next one is work release. Now, again, this kind of goes back to criminal proceedings. What work release is you are going to be in prison, but you are allowed to leave that facility during the day to go to work, but you must return either at the night, or you can do what are called weekenders, where you are basically out of prison during the week and you serve your sentence over the weekend. Now, again, it kind of depends on the crime, or it depends on the defendant, the person who committed the crime, as to if the court's going to allow this. But work release can be a way to, in fact, keep someone in prison, but also allow them to still serve in society. Now, last one is imprisonment. Now, this is really about as harsh as we can get. We're going to talk about one more step up in just a moment. But imprisonment is you're going to serve a certain amount of time in prison. Now, we talked about how a felony is a harsher crime. That means that harsher punishments come with it. Really, kind of the distinction between felony and misdemeanor is if you commit a felony, you can assume that there will be at least 1 year, if not more, in prison, whereas misdemeanors are less than a year in prison. Now, there is one other thing that in our society we can use as a deterrent. This is the death penalty. Now, we've kind of talked about this in passing as well. The death penalty is a state option, because there is only one crime that can be that the death penalty is an option for. So each state gets to determine if they are going to be a death penalty state or if they're not. Currently, as we sit, there are 28 states that are death penalty states, but each state gets to determine how they want to do this. Now, in years past, Colorado has been a death penalty state, but in the spring of 2020, we're going to revoke our death penalty. The Colorado legislature and the governor are going to do away with it. Now, in Colorado, it's not necessarily that we used our death penalty very often. In fact, we used it fairly rarely. But the thing about the death penalty is it can be very expensive, because if you're convicted and your sentence is the death penalty, you can appeal it over and over and over again. And appealing a death penalty conviction can get very expensive for court proceedings. So what the Colorado legislature and Colorado governor said is, as a state that doesn't really use it that often, why do we even have it in place? At the time when it was revoked, we had 3 people that were on death row, and their sentence was commuted or reduced to life in prison. So as of right now, Colorado does not have the death penalty. Now, it could change in the future. If you get a different Colorado legislature and you get a different governor, it's possible that they'll reinstate it. This is a state power if they want to have the death penalty or not, because there is one crime that is eligible for the death penalty. It's only applicable for first-degree murder. Now, as we've kind of talked about before, first-degree murder is different from the other types of homicide, because first-degree murder is premeditated, it's thought out, it's planned, and it's done with malice. This is the only crime that's eligible for the death penalty, and each state gets to determine if they're a death penalty state. Now, up until just a couple years ago, murder was almost entirely a state issue. A couple of years ago, the federal government decided to reinstitute something that they had, where there is now federal murder cases, but there are a very few and far between if you compare it to the numbers of the states. States that get to control if they are a death penalty state, and they're the ones that are responsible for trying murder cases. Now, with that said, this concludes our sentencing and punishment lecture. We're going to apply something to this a little bit later on.